Tēnā koutou, tēnā toto, katoa, ko Lisa Ellis, toku ingoa. I am here first and foremost to give you the health and safety message. If you're interested in finding the toilets, they are out this door to the left, and there are toilets for ladies straight through the double doors, and toilets for men a little bit further on and left again. The exits for this room are forward to the left and right and straight through the center in the back. At the conclusion of this talk, you are all invited to attend a reception with us in the staff club, which is just over the bridge behind us. We'll be on the top floor of the staff club, and if you would like a lift rather than to walk the stairs up to the room to meet us all, there is a lift on the far corner of the staff club nearest to the clock tower, so don't feel like stairs are going to keep you from enjoying the conviviality with all of us. Greetings to everyone and welcome to the University of Otago's annual De Carle lecture series. I am really happy to have the duty to reintroduce Associate Professor Ben McKean, who was with us, as you know, last week. I'm happy to introduce Ben on the occasion of the second of our 6 lecture series in the De Carle Distinguished Lectures. As many of you remember, Ben is an associate professor at the Otago State University, teaching politics there. Oh my gosh, why can't it be Otago? That would be so much better. That is the ultimate subliminal slip. Yeah, unfortunately at the Ohio State University. And before that, he was teaching political theory at Chicago. Ben has written about global justice, about populism, about freedom, about many other topics. All of these things are worth reading, and I hope you will join me in giving Ben a warm welcome to the podium for this second lecture.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa, and thanks to everybody for coming. It's great to be here and to be continuing the De Carle lecture series. So I'm just going to get into it, unless there's any problem with the mic or anything. Great. So if there's one thing that people say, we could say safely about climate change, it's that there's a problem of time. Right? As you can see, this is a collection of headlines over the past few years about how we are running out of time to address this problem, right? In fact, you can see from this editorial cartoon that back in 2009, people said we were running out of time. Article from The Guardian on top, scientists deliver final warning on climate crisis. Act now or it's too late. This article is more than 2 years old. So we are clearly clearly the climate crisis is a matter of urgency, right? We have a temporal problem. We have this experience of crisis and an experience of what many people want to call an emergency. So in the last lecture, I talked about the climate theorist and activist Andreas Malm and his book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Malm argues, quote, in some respects, this emergency is worse than even grave historic injustices like slavery or apartheid because of, quote, the one dimension that most distinctly sets this crisis apart, time. The onrush of catastrophe has a temporality of its own and imposes tight constraints on those who want to fight. And it's in part because we're short on time that Malm says we need to change our tactics and move to direct action like blowing up a pipeline. Now, there's a question here about this feeling of crisis and whether or not it's really politically productive, right? Do we really want to encourage people to think of this as a crisis? Does that move people to action or does it inhibit it? In his earlier work, The Progress of This Storm, Malm thought that it would move people to action. He expressed confidence that the reality of the climate crisis would move us out of this kind of postmodern, neoliberal, there is no alternative, eternal present, and kick us back into history where people would start to take action to address this problem. I'm not sure the past 5 years, 7 years have shown that to be true. Lauren Berlant, by contrast, in her work Cruel Optimism, sees the experience of crisis as actually keeping us in place, right? Intensifying the experience of crisis only makes us feel more the fact that we can't get out of where we are, this kind of unending intensity of what she calls the overwhelmingly present moment. And so in the previous lecture, I argued that against that feeling of crisis, we should think about dealing with climate over what I called the temporality of a long catastrophe. So I was drawing from Kyle White's critique of what he calls crisis epistemology. The idea that the climate crisis is a crisis suggests that it's something new, right? But he says, in fact, from an indigenous perspective, there's nothing new about capitalist settler colonial societies destroying the earth, right? In fact, our world, to his ancestors, would already look like a kind of post-apocalyptic dystopia. So we need to deal with this problem. It remains an urgent problem, but thinking of it as a crisis makes it seem like it's something different than what we faced before. But we have many factors in our experience of political life that intensify that experience of crisis and that make us feel like we need to act immediately, right? So in fact, the neoliberal capitalism that we live under feeds on speed and instantaneity, right? If you can do something faster than somebody else, then there are profits that can be made, right? In fact, with certain kinds of electronic equities trading, a fraction of a second can be the difference between a fortune and ruin. So doing things faster is something that there's a lot of economic pressure on, right, to do. And as consumers, in some ways, we benefit from that, right? We've become very accustomed to getting what we want at the click of a button. Right? It just seems normal. Now, of course, I'll get a delivery tomorrow or even in a few hours. And of course, there's also the information dimension that we live under, right? Right now, with information technology moving as quickly as it is, we know what's happening instantly and constantly, right? So because we're so bombarded with updates, everything feels like a crisis. But of course, if everything feels like a crisis, that makes it hard for anything to stand out as a crisis. So there's a lot of reasons to think that one of the things that we need to do is slow down, right? The kind of political organizing that we really need to do to address the climate crisis takes time. It requires building trust, requires building relationships. Those are not things that can be done overnight. Right? And so for the same reason, Kyle White calls for replacing epistemologies of crisis with what he calls epistemologies of coordination, right, to develop our relations among each other. And in doing that, he's aligning with a very long tradition of thinking about and enacting political organizing. So Ella Baker, who was one of the key organizers of the Black Freedom Movement in the United States, talked about what she called spade work, right, which is the long, hard, boring, and time-consuming work that building a political movement actually requires. Knocking on doors, phone banking, mobilizing, right? All in the service of trying to get people to join organizations, to take action, and to change how they think about themselves, right? To move from thinking of themselves as bystanders to politics, to thinking of themselves as participants in politics, political actors who are members of a group of people who are doing something. But changing people's self-conceptions like that takes time. And that's especially hard in this social context where we expect things to happen fast, right? And in fact, of course, we do need to act fast. But what we have is a kind of mismatch in our expectations about time, right? We're habituated in so many parts of our lives for things to happen instantly, for problems to be solved quickly, for things to be delivered to us instantly, for information to get to us quickly. And because we're habituated to speed, we get easily disillusioned, frustrated, and anxious when things take time, right? When things like political organizing don't produce immediate results. So we have this kind of disillusionment with political action that can sit in very quickly because of this temporal mismatch. So you see this, I think, reflected in a lot of the writing about climate. Here's a quote from Utopianism for a Dying Planet by Gregory Claes. He says, "We must learn to interact more in order to shop less. And all this must be done within about a decade or it'll be too late." That's not the kind of thing you can learn in a decade, right? That's simply not something that can be done. And so we need to think about what that means. What does it mean that we are in a situation where we need to act quickly, but the tools that we have to address the problem require us to act slowly? right? So I call this a kind of temporal double bind that we face, right? We have these two demands on us. So how can we be oriented to this temporal double bind in a way that will avoid that problem of disillusionment, that frustration we get from expecting things to happen quickly, but instead taking time? Now, this is one, I think, of many different kinds of conflicting temporalities that we often experience, right? There are synchronic temporalities that can be in conflict, different kinds of temporalities of the present, like the fast time of neoliberal markets and the slow time of community organizing. But there's also diachronic temporal conflicts, right? The temporality that develops over time. Are things getting better? Are things getting worse? Is it both? And if it's both, how do we think about that? So these temporal tensions shape climate politics, but they also shape politics more generally, right? I think climate makes them especially vivid, but they're also part of a larger dynamic that we need to understand. Now, in the past, a lot of these conflicting temporalities could be resolved. They could be brought into alignment through a belief in progress, right? Yes, we're experiencing different things. We're not really sure how our day-to-day life fits in the longer time of social change. But if the arc of the moral universe is long, it bends towards justice, right? Is a quote, an often abused quote from Martin Luther King Jr. But I think that kind of faith in progress, that belief in progress, isn't really available to us with respect to climate. It isn't the case that our actions are making things better right now. We don't have a way to see that we're bending the arc. Unless, now some people, I think, engage in some wishful thinking. There's some people who think that technology will save us. I'm not that optimistic, right? I think that we need to make some very radical changes to our social and political institutions, and we're not making a lot of progress in doing so. I think you can see the importance of time reflected in arguments about labels like the Anthropocene, right? People often ask whether or not that's the right way to think about it, or is it the Capitalocene? People are having these arguments because they're trying to process the right way of thinking about time with respect to climate change and the politics of climate change. So I think I'm picking up on something here that is reflected pretty broadly in arguments about climate. So what I want to do for the rest of the lecture, having introduced this problem of a temporal double bind, is to first talk a little bit generally about the importance of time in orienting us to politics, and then go back in time to talk about how we got here, right? To talk about the idea of theodicy as a way of organizing the politics of time as a temporal genre, to talk about how that gets secularized into a narrative of progress and how that's connected to the growth of capitalism, the way that the climate crisis upsets some of these assumptions, disorienting us so we don't really know how to think about this problem. I'm going to look at one philosopher's response to this. Olufemi Tewo, who's a philosopher at Georgetown University, proposes thinking like an ancestor as a way of orienting us to the time of climate justice. So I'm going to introduce that idea, explain some problems with it, and then I'll turn to my own proposal, which is to try to understand the political economy of attention and to see climate struggles as a fight for time. So that's where we're going to go. So the significance of time in politics, right? In some ways, this might seem obvious, but often I think the role of time in politics is hidden. Right? Elizabeth Cohen wrote a very good book called The Political Value of Time, and she says time can easily appear almost natural when compared to the normativity of something like rules about who's eligible to vote or to receive formal representation. But when we think about how politics should be, when we think about the normativity of politics, time plays a big role. It matters how often elections are, matters how long it takes to become a citizen of a country, matters how long people are sentenced to jail. All of these are times when how much time something takes makes a big difference to whether or not we want to count something as a democracy, for example. But it's also the case that the experience of really existing political institutions shapes our experience of time. Right? So as Cohen points out, deadlines that recur carve out durations of time and mark them as significant. And there's also a certain kind of experience of time that's really important to the experience of the nation state itself. She says shared temporal context facilitated by the regularization of clock time was crucial to the founding of the modern nation state. Right? And as Paulina Ochoa Espejo has argued, the idea of the people only makes sense over time. The people has to last over a period in order to be real. But it also has to exist together in time. The simultaneity of being the people at the same time is really important to the idea of a nation state. And that's drawing on a well-known argument from Benedict Anderson, who in his book Imagined Communities talked about how nationalism took over the world and came to make sense to people. Right? And part of his argument is that the way nationalism came to make sense to people is that they would read the newspaper every day. And in doing that, they weren't just getting the information from it. Right? They were also sharing a language and sharing a time, because they knew that other people were also reading the same thing at the same time. And that enabled them to imagine who the people were, what the nation was. And so one of the arguments I'm going to make later on is that this is an important precedent for thinking about, because right now, there's a different kind of political simultaneity that's happening. And we're getting our information simultaneously in a different way. And that's creating different kinds of political imaginaries. So to understand the politics of time and the different ways it can be organized, I use this term I borrow from Lauren Berlant, which is the idea of a temporal genre. Right? Now, a genre, of course, is just a kind of category of ways of organizing narratives or musical styles, movies, comedies, tragedies, melodramas. The idea of a temporal genre might be a little bit less familiar. Right? But part of her idea, drawing on the concept from Raymond Williams, the structure of feeling that I introduced in the first lecture, she says that those structures of feeling, those emergent emotions that tell us something about underlying social and political relationships, also are connected to our shared experiences of time. So she says affective responses may be said significantly to exemplify shared historical time. So there's experiences of time that tell us something about the underlying social and political institutions. Right? And if we reflect critically on these temporal genres, that can help us make sense of these institutions. It can help us understand our attachments to them. And it can help us decide whether or not to accept the politics that we have. So I want us to think about the temporal genres that have structured our politics in the past, right? How the climate crisis upends those temporal genres, and what other temporal genres are available to us today to orient us to climate politics now. So to do that, I'm going to go back in time, as I said, right? So we have one of the most important temporal genres for organizing our experience of politics may not initially appear to be an obviously political idea or an obviously temporal one, but it's the idea of theodicy. Right? Now, theodicy, I have a quote here, standard kind of definition from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. A theodicy is an attempt to show how the justice, goodness, and other features of God can be upheld in light of the evils of our world. Right? So if God is omnipotent, omniscient, and good, why does life suck? Why are there so many things that are bad about our world? Right? Why are there the pains and injustices of our existence? Right? And this is, of course, a particular kind of challenge for monotheistic religions that endorse this view of God. So to put it in a more temporal register, we might ask, how are we supposed to reconcile our time on Earth with God's perspective of eternity? Right? And obviously, I've put up a picture of one of the editions of the book of Job here. This is a question and a problem that goes back long before modernity. But it is a question that occurs with a particular force in modernity, and a particular force especially during the Enlightenment. So the term theodicy is invented by Leibniz, the German philosopher, a mathematician, and diplomat, as the sort of rising rationalism of the Enlightenment period makes this question of theodicy especially pressing. Now, Leibniz grappled with this throughout his life, and I've just selected a couple quotations from one of his writings to give you a sense of the kind of argument that he was offering. So this is from On the Ultimate Origination of Things from 1697. So he argues in this first quote that the world that exists is the one through which the most essence or possibility is brought into existence. So it's a kind of metaphysically perfect world. It has the most possible things in it. But it also follows that the world is morally most perfect, since moral perfection is in reality physical perfection with respect to minds. And he says we must hold that afflictions, especially those the good have, only lead to their greater good. Right? So we can be reassured that this is the best of all possible worlds, and thereby make our pains and injustices more tolerable. It has to be this way. Now, very shortly after Leibniz made these arguments, they came under enormous pressure from natural disasters. And in fact, specifically from the earthquake in Lisbon on November 1st in 1755. Right? So I think it's notable as we're thinking ahead about climate, already the Earth has posed a big challenge to these ways of trying to make sense of the world, our ways of making sense of the world. And how to understand natural disasters has been a big and important part of our politics. Right, so this earthquake in 1755 occurred on All Saints' Day, which was significant as people tried to interpret its meaning. Huge earthquake, it was something like a 9.0 on the Richter scale, lasted for 4 or 5 minutes. It was followed by a tsunami, everything was on fire. Something like 100,000 people died. And the shocks from the earthquake were felt as far away as Finland. Most of the buildings in Lisbon were destroyed, right, including most of the churches, and something like 1/5 of the population died. So this is a major natural disaster, and it gave rise to not just the crisis of responding to the physical devastation, but it gave rise to a crisis of meaning, right? Was this natural disaster a divine judgment on the country? Right? How could you reconcile this kind of devastation, which killed so many innocent people, with the belief in an omniscient, omnipotent, and just God? Right? Now notice, Theodicy doesn't answer that question. Right? It didn't mean that the meaning of this event was settled, but it was a concept people used to provide an orientation to the event. Right? It organized disagreement about the meaning of what happened. And so philosophers around Europe took up this question of the Lisbon earthquake in Theodicy. About a month later, Voltaire composed his poem on the Lisbon disaster, which took aim at Leibniz and Alexander Pope and ridiculed the idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds. So he said, among other parts of the poem I could quote, "When the earth gapes my body to entomb, I justly may complain of such a doom." Right? Theodicy would say, well, it's the best of all possible worlds, as Voltaire construes it. And he says, no, I have a right to complain about the world and about the pains in it. He elaborated on these ideas famously in Candide a few years ago, and he also got into a very long argument with Rousseau about this. All arguments with Rousseau turned into long arguments. At the same time, Immanuel Kant also was writing about the Lisbon earthquake, but not yet directly from the perspective of Theodicy, actually. The Kant of 1756 was a younger Kant. He's about 32, and he's just starting his career as a university lecturer, and initially his most popular early lectures are on geography. And so he's writing about the Lisbon earthquake. He publishes 3 different articles the following year, trying to understand the causes of the earthquake. Not completely disconnected from questions of Theodicy, but not as directly engaged at this time. Later on, Kant does engage quite explicitly in writings about Theodicy. And I think those writings are going to be important for us to look at briefly in order to see how Theodicy becomes an account of progress, right? And how that temporal dimension gets added to it. So Kant also says he's very interested in orientation. And in his essay, What Does It Mean to Orient Oneself in Thinking? He affirms the idea that we need to believe in God to be oriented in thinking, right? He says without that, you can't provide a satisfactory ground for understanding the contingency of the existence of things in the world, let alone for the purposiveness and order which is encountered everywhere in such a wondrous degree. And in his later essay on the miscarriage of all philosophical trials in Theodicy, he says, all Theodicy should truly be an interpretation of nature, insofar as God announces his will through it. Right? So the idea that we have to understand, in order to understand nature, we need to think about it through this kind of temporal genre is really important. But what Kant does to make, I think, the temporal dimension really clear and to turn Theodicy into a story of progress is a story he tells here in his lectures on the philosophical doctrine of religion, where he says, in this earthly world, there is only progress, right? God wills the elimination of evil through the all-powerful development of the germ toward perfection. He wills that evil be removed through the progress toward good. So in Kant's argument, crucially, the way that we understand the presence of evil in the world is through the idea of progress, the idea that things are getting better, right? And without that idea, we can't understand why there are problems in the world, why there are injustices. And so there are, I think, important political implications of the way that Kant turns Theodicy into a story of progress, right? That idea of progress makes it possible to offer a universal history, right? That universal history lets us reconcile these competing kinds of time, right? With Kant's idea of progress in place, we can make sense of the relationship between the time of an individual life, the time of the whole development of the whole species, and the perspective of eternity. Right? And so once we have that, once we believe in progress, he says we should be content with providence and with the course of human affairs as a whole, which does not begin with good and then proceed to evil, as it does in the story of Adam and Eve, but develops gradually from the worse to the better, and each individual for his own part called upon by nature itself to contribute towards this progress to the best of his ability. And I think we can also see the important political implications of Kant's view of progress here when we think about what it means that his universal history covers humanity as a whole. Because one of the things that it means is that it's given us a new way to say some people are less developed than other people, that their ways of living belong to the past, and that their ways of living, or in some cases, even those people, should be left there in the past. Right? So he says in 1777, 78, we find people who do not appear to progress in the perfection of human nature. Rather, they have come to a standstill, while others, as in Europe, always progress. And then he says later on in the same passage about the indigenous people of the Americas, we believe even now that they will attain to no perfection, for it appears that they will all be exterminated. Not through acts of murder, for that would be too gruesome, but rather they'll die out. And so time becomes not just, so this temporal genre of progress becomes not just a way of making sense of existing institutions, but becomes a way of understanding and justifying domination. So I think it's important to remember these structures of feeling, right, emerge from social and political relations. These ideas about progress and theodicy aren't happening disconnected from real-world politics. Right? These temporal genres are connected to what's happening in the world. They both help us make sense of it, but they can also reinforce certain things that are happening by telling us they make sense. Right? So progress in particular emerges in some ways to make sense of domination that's already happened. Right? It emerges to interpret what does colonialism mean? And of course that idea of progress, that temporal genre, can then be reinforced by further domination that's conducted in its name. And so we can see that happen in the world as this imposition of kind of progressive or developmental time, this diachronic temporality gets imposed on the whole world. Right? The universal history of progress means that some people need to catch up to Europe. And then part of what that means is that in the real world, there's also then the imposition of simultaneity and clock time. Right? We also develop a way of understanding the whole world synchronously through the official deployment of Greenwich Mean Time. Right? One of the high points in a certain respect of the British Empire is declaring that it's the center of time, right? And to say that everyone is going to follow their view of what time is, right? And so we have this article from Katharina Hunfeld where she argues that part of how we should understand the effect of colonialism and the imposition of clock time is that it aimed to replace diverse local times with a centralized and standardized notion of time that made colonial Britain the temporal center of the world. So that is a story in part about how colonialism is justified by a certain kind of temporal genre and expands that temporal genre to impose it on the rest of the world. But at the same time, there's also a politics of time happening with the expansion of capitalism that I want to talk about. Right? So with the growth and expansion of capitalism, people's synchronic experience of time changes. Right? And to understand this, I think it's useful to turn to the analysis of this offered by Marx in Capital, where he analyzes this role of abstract time in capitalism. Right? Men are increasingly paid for their time as workers. right? They're not being paid for the good that they've produced. They're being paid for their time, right? They're being paid as employees, where someone else now has to pay them and then get to be in charge of their time as a result, right? And so as money is being used to measure time, it's creating time equivalence between different kinds of labor, right? Oh, well, if you get paid $3 and he gets paid $6, right? There's ways of making the labor itself now equivalent. And so as labor becomes exchangeable in this way, as people are selling the time of their labor power, right, the very idea of labor kind of becomes abstracted, right? Rather than people being paid for the specific task they're being performed, or for them being to understand themselves as being, a miller or whatever, they're being paid for their time. And so you can see this as being a part of the general domination that Marx analyzes of how exchange value replaces use value. Things become important because of what you can pay for them rather than for what they do. Right? And that's true of humans and for our labor just as it's true for commodities. Right? And so that means our experience of time is transformed even when we're off the clock. Right? We know if we're not working, we could be getting paid during that time. Right? And so we're never, in that sense, really out of that capitalist temporality. Right? That becomes an ever-present possibility. And it also generates a temporal tension between wage labor, which at the time is going to be overwhelmingly male initially, and unpaid care work, which will be overwhelmingly female. So even the time of the family, right, is going to be affected and shaped by this new experience of time that's introduced, this kind of abstract time that characterizes our life under capitalism. Right? Everybody knows time is money. And this is effectively just a way of explaining what that means for our experience of time. So Moïse Postone was, I think, was the preeminent kind of analyst of understanding how Marx saw this introduction of abstract time as being a part of how capitalism dominates us. He writes in his book, Time, Labor, and Social Domination, the abstract form of time associated with the new structure of social relations also expressed a new form of domination. The new time proclaimed by the clock towers, which frequently were erected opposite the church bell towers, was the time associated with a new social order, dominated by the bourgeoisie. The temporal social forms have a life of their own and are compelling for all members of capitalist society, even if in a way that benefits the bourgeois class materially. Although constituted socially, time in capitalism exerts an abstract form of compulsion. So I think it's important for us to think about what Postone means by this abstract form of compulsion. Right? And part of what he's suggesting is we always feel like we're falling behind with time. Right? We're always feeling like we have to work because we do. Right? In fact, if we don't work, we're not going to get paid and we'll starve. Or if we're a capitalist, if we don't work, someone else is going to make more profits and our business will go under. So this experience of time moving forward takes on a very different character under capitalism than it has under other economic systems. Right? He says this time under capitalism itself then partakes in that feeling of inexorableness. So it's also the case then as a result of that, it's not just our day-to-day experience of time that changes, right? The idea, the feeling that, well, I could be making money right now, but also it's our experience of what progress means that changes, right? So not only does the expansion of capitalism make universal history possible by imposing uniform abstract time on the world, right? But capitalism's structural need for growth helps sustain that experience of and belief in progress. All of the time, we're confronted by experiences that say, well, things have to get bigger, things have to get better, otherwise they're going to disappear, right? I need to beat the other guy for the job or I'm going to disappear. My business needs to grow more or it's going to disappear. All of those things make the idea of progress make sense in a very different kind of vivid way. So it becomes a temporal genre connected to real institutional experiences. Of course, other temporalities endured during this time. It's not as though people didn't have other experiences of time. And of course, people resisted the imposition of these institutions and temporalities. But once those institutions are imposed, they're going to change our experience of time. And so we'll need some temporal genre to make sense of them. And of course, it's not as though growth or this idea of progress was sort of politically univocal. This idea of growth also made a lot of progressive politics possible, right? If the pie is growing, it becomes much easier to redistribute it, right? And this idea that the pie is growing was widely shared by people on the left and the right. So Stefan Eich, who's a political theorist, had a very interesting article called The Theodicy of Growth about the liberal egalitarian philosopher John Rawls. And Eich writes, the quest for economic growth remains in this sense the last master theodicy of modern politics. Right? Because everybody kind of agreed that economic growth was valuable. The question was just how to achieve it, right? Do we achieve it through neoliberal ways? Do we achieve it through social democratic ways? But now we face a very important challenge to this idea of progress, right? Capital accumulation and the experience of progress can and have perhaps come apart, right? So I've got these two graphs up here, one showing kind of updated hockey stick graph showing the measured temperature over the past 2 centuries, along with here carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the past 800,000 years. Are these charts that show progress? Right? And in what sense do they show progress? One of the effects of these, one of the predictable effects of these, right, is that they will make much of the world less habitable for us, right? Potentially dramatically so. Does it count as progress if we're ruining the only planet we've ever lived on? This is a chart showing some of the tipping points that the climate faces, right? Right now, this is not, that is to say, we're no longer in a situation where things are just accreting one by one, going up slowly. We might very easily be in a situation where we reach a tipping point and things get dramatically worse. So here's a quote from Professor William Ripple, right? He says, we're already in the midst of abrupt climate upheaval, which jeopardizes life on Earth like nothing humans have ever seen. Is that progress? It's certainly going to continue to be capital accumulation, right? So you have here a headline, big banks predict catastrophic warming with profit potential. This is just from 2 days ago, where Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, and other banks are making predictions about how to make money in the future, right? And they've included in their predictions, well, how will we make money amidst climate change? Morgan Stanley, their plans expect a global average temperature rise of 3 degrees, right? That's the world they're planning for and trying to make sure it's a profitable world. So capital accumulation will continue, but is what's happening now progress? I want to circle back very briefly to Kant because I think it's really striking how he answers this in this essay, An Old Question Raised Again, is the human race constantly progressing? Right? As we've seen, he clearly believes in progress. One of the reasons why he did is he said decline into wickedness cannot be incessant in the human race. For at a certain stage of disintegration, the human race would destroy itself. Well, bad news. And actually, he saw this, right? He has a caveat, a really interesting caveat in his idea about progress. He says the human race has always been in progress toward the better and will continue to be so henceforth, provided at least that there does not by some chance occur a second epoch of natural revolution which will push aside the human race to clear the stage for other creatures. So, and he says, for in the face of the omnipotence of nature, the human being is, in his turn, but a trifle. So Kant already knew, in that sense, that like there was one other alternative to progress, and that was we get wiped out. But I think the real reason why climate change poses such a potent challenge to the temporal genres that we've used to organize politics for so many of the past hundreds of years, is that it's not just that climate change is bad. It's not just like, oh, it seems like things are getting worse. It's that the very same social forces that have defined progress for the last several centuries are now bringing us to ruin. Right? And it feels like we can't stop them. Right? They seem inexorable and out of our control, even though we know we initiated them. Right? But we can't seem to get off this track. We can't seem to stop these lines from going up. And so it seems like the long process of bringing nature under our control has backfired. Right? All of the things that we've done to bring nature under control, to sell it to each other, to tame it so that we can make money, right, now have turned into a world where the things that we've been doing for so long are not just making the world worse, but potentially making it uninhabitable, at least vast parts of it. So what seemed like rational things to do to make money and get ahead have turned out in this way to be deeply irrational. And that's basically the story that the critical theorists Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno tell in their book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, that the tools of the Enlightenment have produced a world that, as they put it, radiates disaster. Now, they weren't thinking about climate change, right? They were thinking about fascism and World War II and the Holocaust. But I think that we can say something similar here, right? There were many challenges to the idea of progress in the 20th century. And I think climate change is, at least for the 21st century, right, fulfilling a similar function. So what's next? How else can we kind of think about time, the politics of time, if our ideas of progress are unsettled? Right? Amitav Ghosh is a novelist and thinker who's thought about this, thankfully. And he's, as a writer, he's given 3 reasons why literary fiction has had a hard time imagining climate change. Right? And this is going to be helpful for us because we also need political narratives. And I think that the same things that make it hard to tell fictional stories about climate change also make it hard for us politically to narrate what's happening in time. Right? So he says climate change is hard to write a novel about because you don't have only humans as characters. You have an extremely long time scale that's very counter to ordinary forms of human narrative. And because, at least because we're more accustomed to stories about individuals than to stories about collectives. Right? The kinds of protagonists we expect are people, individual people. And the story about climate change is just simply not going to be solved by any one individual. There's not going to be a hero that fixes this for us. So we have a hard time thinking about what it means. And there also isn't quite a bad guy in the same way. Right? This is a massive process, a structural process that's ongoing. And so it's hard to narrate. And so Ghosh suggests that climate change may require us to abandon some of our most treasured ideas about political virtue. For example, be the change you want to see. What we need instead, he suggests, is to find a way out of the individualizing imaginary in which we're trapped. So the philosopher Olufemi Taiwo has a suggestion for how to do that. Right? He proposes this idea of thinking like an ancestor as a new kind of temporal genre, well, not a new one, in many respects a quite old one, right? But one that is newly relevant under conditions of climate change. So Taiwo writes, how do we will ourselves to do the hard work of actions that may only be completed by our descendants? One way to make progress on this is to recover an aspect of many cultures' moral life that modern cultural life, particularly given the kinds of cultural perspectives that circulate under capitalism, tends to de-emphasize: the moral perspective of the ancestor. And he's citing here his own ancestors. He's of Yoruban descent, and he's citing recent work on the Yoruba philosophy of life. But it's not a view, he says, that's confined to the Yoruba. He says we're defined by what kind of ancestors we choose to be. This perspective is available to everyone. If I want to be an ancestor, I should take the kinds of steps worth following and start or continue the kinds of projects worth finishing. So his example is of creating barrels for fermenting sake and miso. Right? So this is a particular kind of Japanese practice. It requires special cedar trees that take 80 years to grow, in his telling. I don't actually know anything about this. Right? But that means that given the length of time it takes the trees to grow big enough for them to be cut down and used in the barrels, this process always needs to be initiated by people who won't see the final product. Right? And it's a practice, he says, that persisted, even though it took so long, despite interruption by World War II, structural changes in food production, and so on. So he says that thinking like an ancestor helps reconcile us to this fact about time, that the success of our projects is not fully in our control. Right? It's not an individual story, but it depends on both past and future generations. And he thinks this will help us think about climate. Right? He says the ancestor perspective can get us out of some ways of thinking about climate justice that are dead ends. Rapid social change allows us personally, right, to witness and receive some of the most prized fruits of our social justice labor. That'd be wonderful. But I suspect that embracing the ancestor perspective will make us less desperate in the face of more outcomes. And he also suggests, I like this phrase a lot, the ancestor perspective helps ground a kind of revolutionary patience while at the same time rejecting complacency. I think that's a really admirable idea. I like the idea of revolutionary patience. And I think there's clearly a lot of value in embracing the perspective of the ancestor. Right? That kind of anticipatory retrospection, imagining what today will look like from the perspective of the future, can be a really useful way to get perspective on things. But I think it's an incomplete solution to the climate anxiety that arises from our temporal double bind. So climate change isn't like making a sake barrel, basically. Right? Practitioners of this have a model of how the barrel making process is supposed to go. Right? They know it's going to be long, they know it's prone to interruption, but they basically know how to get from A to B. We don't know that about climate. We don't know how to fix this problem politically, right? So turning to the future is kind of an effort to leap over this problem of the present, the question of how we transition to a different political economy of energy. Right? And I think that what gives rise to despair over climate isn't an inability to imagine a good future, but it's an inability to imagine how we get there. Right? And I don't know that the perspective of the ancestor really helps us address that. So here's my alternative. Right? Don't look to the future to understand, but try to understand the present day causes of temporal tension. Right? And so to do that, I turned to this work from 1967 by the French theoretician Guy Debord. Debord was a member of a group called the Situationist International. They were an avant-garde group both politically and artistically. They were a Marxist group that drew on surrealism and Dadaism. Debord, after writing this book, turned it into a film. So they're very engaged with questions of aesthetics. But I think that this book really has something to say about the situation that we're in, even though it's not obviously a work about climate. Right? I think that the Society of the Spectacle helps us think about the way that political and economic institutions are arranged to control our attention and to shape our experience of time, right? Orienting us to our temporal double bind as something that's inescapable. Right? So as we've already seen, temporality under capitalism is experienced as inevitable and objective, but it's produced, our particular experience of time is produced by our institutional arrangements, by our political and social institutions. So if we can understand our experience of temporality as a political decision, then we can be better oriented to opportunities to choose otherwise. So the upshot that I'm going to argue in this final part of the lecture is that achieving climate justice requires a fight to control our own time so that it's possible to build the social relationships that we need. So what's Debord's argument in the Society of the Spectacle? As you'll see in a moment when I show some quotes from the work, if you're not familiar with it, it's written in a very kind of gnomic style. Right? It's kind of very epigrammatic, and it's written in a way where, in essence, he doesn't want it to become easily absorbed and become a part of the spectacle that he's criticizing. So he deliberately makes it hard to read. Right? So let me give at least a quick kind of introduction so you can see the kind of thing he's talking about. All right, so what does it mean to live in the Society of the Spectacle, a spectacular society? Well, start by imagining, if you can, if you experience social life and understood yourself in reality primarily through images on a screen. Right? But now imagine if everyone else did the same thing, so that what counts as reality is the fact that everyone is looking at each other through images on a screen. Right? And now, further, imagine that capital accumulation relies on everyone continuing to experience reality through the images they see on their phone or screen. Now, this isn't exactly a description of our world, right? Debord's writing in 1967. So I think it's striking that we can immediately see continuities between what he's saying and our own experiences of the world. Right? So on the one hand, I think that means there's a lot of foresight here. And also, what we're experiencing is not completely out of nowhere, right? So Here's some of what Debord says about the society of the spectacle in his own words. Right? He says, the entire life of societies in which modern conditions of production reign announces itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation. The spectacle is not a collection of images, but a social relation among people mediated by images. And finally, the spectacle is nothing other than the sense of the total practice of social economic formation, its use of time. It's the historical moment which contains us. So as I said, these are kind of big pronouncements, and it's not immediately obvious what they mean, but I want to suggest a kind of interpretive key here, right? Which is, if you look at the first sentence of Marx's Capital, he says, the wealth of societies dominated by the capitalist mode of production appears in the form of an enormous accumulation of commodities. Marx is actually just quoting himself in that first thing. I don't know why he put enormous accumulation of commodities in quotes. Not a man known for his modesty, I guess. But in other words, in order to understand exactly what's going on in Debord's book, I do need to take one last short detour through the work of Marx himself, and in particular, the young Marx's account of alienation, as this is going to be an important part of understanding what's wrong with the society of the spectacle. Right? So on Marx's account, we're naturally free creatures. Right? It's part of what makes us who we are. Humans can do all kinds of things. But in the world we live in, we're dominated. Right? And so because of that, we're alienated from ourselves. We're alienated from our free nature. So as a result of that, we live a kind of double life. We have the parts of ourselves that are free, the parts of ourselves that are dominated, and we can feel in a kind of attenuated way that things aren't right, that parts of us that should be free, that the way we live doesn't let us live, doesn't give us the kind of freedom that we can experience. And so we project that freedom. We project these human powers onto other parts of society. So for example, we experience unfreedom in civil society, we experience unfreedom in the economy, and so we imagine ourselves free in politics in comparison, right? In a kind of compensation, in fact, right? It's because we're so constrained in some parts of our life that we say, oh, citizenship means we're free people. But citizenship doesn't erase all the ways in which we're dominated in the rest of our lives. And so Marx says, in reality, in life, a double existence, celestial and terrestrial. Man lives in the political community, where he regards himself as a communal being, and in civil society, where he acts simply as a private individual. So the political state in relation to civil society is just as spiritual as is heaven in relation to earth. Right? We're just kind of imagining this sort of freedom, and in doing so, legitimating political institutions that don't really emancipate us. Right? That's part of the argument on the Jewish question. Marx makes similar arguments in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 about religion. Right? Alienated from our freedom, we project that freedom and power onto gods and experience that freedom through religion. Right? So he says the gods in the beginning are not the cause, but the effect of man's intellectual confusion. Later, this relationship becomes reciprocal. Right? And this alienation from our freedom also alienates us from nature. Right? This is a theme that I'll return to later. But I think it's notable, right, that even from his earliest works, Marx is thinking about how capitalism affects our relationship to nature, right, and how it instrumentalizes nature. He writes, man lives on nature, nature is his body, with which he must remain in continuous intercourse if he's not to die. Right? But our connection to our body and our connection to nature as a whole is alienated. It's estranged, right, because we have to reduce nature and we have to reduce our body instrumentally into just another way of trying to survive. And so we don't really connect with the nature and ourselves in this way for him. Now there's an important way in which we also project these powers onto the commodities that we produce and consume. Right? It's not just that we experience, we exaggerate the importance of, or the freedom in politics, or that we invent the powers of the gods in order to compensate for unfreedom. We also feel like the objects in our lives have power over us. Right? In fact, the objects in our lives have more agency in a lot of ways than we do. And so I think you often see this in life, where you see stories where it's actually commodities that are the protagonist. Not the workers who make the t-shirts, right? But it's your t-shirt's life story before it met you. right? The travels of a t-shirt in the global economy, right? These are all ways in which we can see that commodities themselves have this kind of power where they're often endowed imaginatively with agency that really properly belongs to ourselves, right? It's really us that are making these things, but it feels like actually we're the ones who need to work if we want to buy a t-shirt, right? And so it seems like the t-shirt instead is what's moving us rather than us moving it, right? Marx says a bunch of quotes about this. I'm not going to read in the interests of time. But in all of these cases, we have a similar kind of experience, right? Social relations of domination mystify how these products of human labor and thinking are created, right? It mystifies our relationship to politics. It mystifies our relationship to religion. It mystifies our relationship to the commodities that we buy, right? And it does that because we are not free, and so we exaggerate or project our own freedom and power onto these other things that are really produced by us. But Marx says that mystification can't be completely undone until that domination ends. We're going to continue to live under this domination, and so we're going to continue to think in the ways that these institutions and practices encourage us to. It's not enough to just read Capital and then see through commodities. You still have to go to work the next day. And so you're still living in a world in which the reality of commodity fetishism is introduced time after time. So with all that, we can turn back to Debord and see how Debord's account of the society of the spectacle is saying something similar. Because we're not free, because we're not dominated, we attribute freedom and power to the images and screens that we experience so much of social life through. Right? So I think maybe now we can give a better account of these quotations that I started with. Right? And we can see how they're connected to the very similar arguments that we find in Marx. Right? Debord says, the spectacle is the material reconstruction of the religious illusion. Right? The spectacle, mass media, social media, all those things structurally play a similar role, he says, to religion. We give these things a lot of power, but then we think they have the power. It's not power that we've given them. Right? The spectacle is the technical realization of the exile of human powers into a beyond. And he says, commodity fetishism reaches its absolute fulfillment in the spectacle, where the tangible world is replaced by a selection of images which exist above it, and which at the same time are recognized as the tangible par excellence. So in Marx's classic example of commodity fetishism, he talks about how a table begins talking, right? Because you make the table, but the table's a commodity. Even though you've made it, you don't get to set the price, and so it seems like there's some value in the table that belongs to the table, that it wasn't something you put there. Now, in the spectacle, commodity fetishism, you don't even need to sell stuff. You don't need something physical and tangible. The thing that you're projecting your power onto, the thing that's dominating you, is just the images, right? You're spending money to be able to look at stuff. You're spending your time to be able to look at stuff. And so it's commodity fetishism without even any commodities playing a major role in this part of our domination. Right? So the whole point, the whole thing that these modern conditions of production aim at, right, is to take up our time. Right? And so the result of all this is that the spectacle, these modern conditions, direct our attention, making our experience of social relations fundamentally an experience of passive spectatorship. Right? So Debord says, the first phase of the domination of the economy over social life brought about the degradation of being into having. Right? That is to say, something only really counted as meaningful or significant if you owned it. But the present phase of total occupation of social life leads to a generalized sliding of having into appearing, from which all actual having must draw its immediate prestige and its ultimate function. So now it doesn't even count as something meaningful if you own it. You also have to put you having it on social media. Otherwise, who's going to know that you got to have it? Right? The only way in which it feels real is if you share it. Right? And so the spectacle says nothing more than that which appears is good, that which is good appears. Right? So the idea is things are only meaningful if they're appearing to you, but you don't get to decide what appears to you. Right? The algorithm decides, the broadcasters decide. And so part of the domination is having these images through which you interpret social life and experience social life being presented to you, right? So part of it's the content, but also an important part of it's just the structure, right? Just the structure that the only way you experience things is through this kind of passive spectatorship that you're constantly habituated to, right? Even on social media, when it seems like you're having a conversation, right? You're not engaging in a dialogue, right? The spectacle is the opposite of dialogue, Debord says, right? Because what you're really doing is you're caring about how you appear in the conversation. You're not, for the most part, having a dialogue. You're not giving and asking for reasons. You're standing up for your side, right? You're caring about how you look. You're trolling people. All of these forms of engagement that aren't meaningful, right? That are fundamentally not different from being a spectator. Right? And it's because even when you are having these disagreements, you're having them through the spectacle. Right? The spectacle mediates our relationships with each other so that we only connect to each other through it. And so he says, this is a kind of circular production of isolation. Right? It's a way, all of these consumer goods, not just social media, which of course he had no idea about. His examples are the automobile and the television. But these are all parts of modern production that keep us away from each other, that isolate us. If we're connected to each other, it's through talking about the same TV shows, right? If we're connected to each other, it's going to be because we're driving past each other in our different cars, right? All of these, he says, are conditions for the production of lonely crowds. All right, so the spectacle brings us together, but he says it reunites us as separate. So, I mean, I'm not going to belabor some of the obvious details about phone use and spectacle stuff, right? But this is a global problem. It's not, it's like some of the countries where people are most on their phones are in the developing world, right? And in general, right, you're talking about, most people spending 4.5 hours a day on the phone, which is about, if you add it up, about 1 day a week. And of course, it's part of the point here is that it's not just the time that you're doing that, it's that how that shapes all of your experience of time, even when you're not directly doing it. So by directing our attention and mediating our relationships with each other, the spectacle takes up all our time, right? It creates the experience of an endless present by rendering history meaningless and decontextualized, right? It's another image in the spectacle. So Debord says the spectacle is the false consciousness of time, right? And that its function is to make history forgotten within culture, to preserve the threatened equilibrium of a present frozen time. Right? And that idea that we're in this kind of frozen time, a time without history, where nothing can really fundamentally change about some of these political institutions that are causing the climate crisis, right? That all contributes to the temporal double bind that I started with. So Debord updated his essay 20 years later and wrote a kind of sequel called Comments on the Society of the Spectacle, where he talks a little bit about how this process of history becoming meaningless works. Right? Images chosen and constructed by someone else have everywhere become the individual's principal connection to the world. Right? And because within the same image, all things can be juxtaposed without contradiction, it isolates all it shows from its context, its past, its intentions, and its consequences. It is thus completely illogical. Since no one may contradict it, it has the right to contradict itself to correct its past. Right? So to use, for example, social media example, if people say something wrong on Facebook, first of all, they can always find alternative facts online to support themselves. But even when you disagree, ultimately the platform is getting its engagement. It's getting your time. Right? And it's not like anything comes of you correcting somebody. Right? Those two forms of participation can easily coexist next to each other. Right? And so you end up in this world where people get their own history, right? And people get their own present even too. Right? It ends up in this kind of illogical world. Now Debord talks, now I think it's interesting to note that environmental damage and ecological concerns are run throughout this later work on the Comments of Society of the Spectacle. Right? So some of the principal examples of spectacular domination that he gives in this later work are about exposure to nuclear radiation, the depletion of the ozone layer. Right? And that's because there's this kind of idea. Well, obviously we do not want to ruin the planet. And yet we continue to do that, right? And so he says the spectacle offers these different strategies to neutralize information about environmental damage. One is, of course, just putting out disinformation. There's no consequences, really, to putting out fresh images into the spectacle. There's no connection to what's there, there's no accountability for what's said. But by the same token, you can speak the truth within the spectacle, and it can be politically inert, right? Because it's simply another image in the spectacle. It's something, another form of engagement in that sense. But it's not real political participation, right? People might receive it, but it's just going to be another image that people are passive spectators of, right? And so under these kinds of conditions, you can even have people saying the truth about what's happening to the environment, and it won't make a difference. And finally, there's a third thing going on, which I think is really striking, right? Which is that the pervasive publicity of the spectacle gives rise to an assumption that the real truth must be secret, right? If everything is out there, if we're constantly putting things out in public, if all that matters is what really appears, well, a really savvy person would know that there must be some secret behind it, that in fact what really matters maybe isn't appearing. And so you can see this way where if the idea is that the truth is out there, but somewhere else, right, you can see how it gives rise to certain kinds of conspiracy thinking to enable people to explain why environmental damage isn't what it seems, or why COVID is really a lab leak, or any of those kinds of things. So what do we do in response to this kind of situation? If part of the problem is that our time is being taken and our attention is being directed, Debord's suggestion is that we have to politicize this process of occupying our time and try to reclaim our time, right? He says, in the demand to live the historical time which it makes, the proletariat finds the simple, unforgettable center of its revolutionary project, right? That is, people demand the experience to set their own temporality. To really make history would not be to let capitalism dictate the inexorability of time, but to intervene and make a political decision about the times we wanted to live in. And as a kind of utopian endpoint, Debord even suggests what he calls independent federated times of different temporalities that are simultaneously present. So Debord thinks that fighting for control over our time is a demand that a lot of people can get behind, right? He says we may consider as proletarians all people who have no possibility of altering the social space-time that society allots to them, regardless of variations in their degree of affluence or chances for promotion, right? The spectacle takes up everybody's time. Everybody, in that sense, not quite everybody, but the conditions of production of abstract domination, right, have proletarianized people with respect to their experience of time. And so if the spectacle is the false consciousness of time, he says this kind of, as it were, temporal proletariat cannot itself be the power except by becoming the class of consciousness. By demanding that we take back control over our time, we can raise consciousness of the form of domination we're experiencing, sharpen our understanding of the oppression that people are experiencing, and how it contributes ultimately to the climate crisis. I think notably, Debord gives us some reason to think this can be hopeful because, as I said, it's not only ordinary people who experience the spectacle. As I think we've seen rather vividly, even political leaders also live in this world without history, right? They don't really understand deeply because all the information they get is from the spectacle. And so Debord says, once the running of a state involves a permanent and massive shortage of historical knowledge, that state can no longer be led strategically. So that's perhaps a silver lining to the society of the spectacle we find ourselves in. So I want to wrap up, but before I do, I just want to highlight these two limits to Debord's argument. First, Debord was writing in 1967, and at the time, revolution could still feel imminent, right? In fact, it's very much in that sense a pre-1968 text. People really felt like there was something coming. But this structure of feeling of revolution being imminent is, I think, it's safe to say, no longer widely shared. And so I think it structures his work in ways that make it less relevant to us. He's still, in a deep sense, occupying the temporal genre of progress. in a way that I think for us does not make sense. And second, Debord's assumption that we're, as it were, identically situated as consumers of the spectacle doesn't help us think about other parts of the domination we experience, right? People are differently located as workers in relationship to racial capitalism, settler colonialism, social reproduction. Debord's version of the fight for time doesn't really help us think about that. But there's another way of thinking about it proposed by the political theorist Paul Apostolidis, which I think is more helpful. And Apostolidis offers the framework of a fight for time that I think can facilitate solidarity among people who experience work in very different ways. So Apostolidis did field research, unusual for political theorists, and worked with migrant day laborers in the Pacific Northwest in the United States. And he realized in talking to people and doing this kind of worker organizing that many themes were very common to both the day laborers he was working with and to professionals like himself. So he says, precaritization has projected tendrils, sent down roots within multiple class strata well above the bottom among white as well as non-white people in the lives of men and women alike, and in the United States, just as in the societies victimized by US empire in decline. So Apostolidis uses this idea of precarity as a way of bringing people together, right? The fact that time under capitalism is inexorable, that it's moving forward, and if we don't keep up with the Joneses, we're going to lose, right? Leads to very widespread feelings of precarity that Apostolidis says we can employ as we begin building a kind of coalition in this fight for time, right? Even people in multiple class strata experience this precarity, the idea that if we don't keep up, we're going to lose everything. And people don't like that. So we can use that as a framework for this fight for time. So in conclusion, for this lecture, I just want to say the temporal paradox of climate organizing isn't an idiosyncratic challenge, right? It might have seemed like the focus on temporality was a little bit out of left field, but I actually think it's intrinsic to capitalism's relationship to climate change. And so I think fighting climate change requires engaging in this fight for time, right? A demand to control our own time so that we can build the social relations that we need. And I think unlike efforts to imagine the future, to engage in this kind of anticipatory retrospection, Debord's argument directs us to the political constitution of temporality in the present. And so he can better orient us to possibilities of political action today. Though, as I've said, we do need to revise his account for our own specific political conditions. So I want to end with this brief advertisement for the next lecture on Tuesday, which will be back at the museum. And that's this question of in whose name should the fight for time be waged? Right? Many political fights today are waged in the name of the people. Right? We're very much operating in a political framework of popular sovereignty. Politics is about the people being in charge. And so these claims to popular sovereignty can seem both necessary, right? Obviously popular sovereignty has been at the center of many emancipatory projects, but they also seem, at least with respect to climate, indefensible, right? To have any one nation say they need to be free and to care only about themselves looks like a major obstacle to the kind of transnational solidarity required to address climate. So in the next lecture, I'll be trying to think about whether or not popular sovereignty can be useful or in what ways it can be useful, given that it seems both inescapable and indefensible. Thanks.
Ben, thank you so much. Do we have time for questions? If you have a question, raise your hand, and please wait until I bring you the mic to ask it. Questions?
That was great, Ben. Thank you. This is a little unformed as a thought, but I wanted you to, because I really like this idea of revolutionary patience as well. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak to the way in which the Debord stuff and this idea of kind of recapturing our time relates to that question of revolutionary patience, because it would seem like it's almost a condition for us to start thinking about revolutionary patience, but I don't know if that's an implication that matters to you, or so I guess my question is, what's the connection between those two things?
Yeah, thank you. I think many different things can facilitate or encourage revolutionary patience, and I like that idea from Teo quite a bit. I'm less convinced that thinking like an ancestor will. I mean, I'm sure it'll be an important mode of thinking for some people, but I think that it does try to leap over or ignore some of what, for many people, are the sort of primary causes of impatience. But so I think revolutionary patience itself is important, and I think any kind of thinking requires patience. I don't know if it always requires revolutionary patience, but yeah, I do think that part of encouraging people to slow down is trying to get people to think, because the constant bombardment of notifications and everything is like very antithetical to thinking and to patience. So I think broadly there's a need for encouraging that kind of patience. I wouldn't want to say his way can't work, but I think there's other ways that we need to offer.
Hi. A couple of things that affect my view of history is being much influenced by what you might think of as the Bloomsbury view of 20th century history. And the Bloomsbury view of history is devised by people who were adults before the beginning of the First World War. They were usually of a left-wing or progressive persuasion, but then they saw the First World War kind of destroy civilization and put huge obstacles in the way of social hope, leading to the further catastrophe of World War II. And they wanted to say, well, the consequence they drew was there's no guarantee of any kind of progress. They also drew the bigger consequence that history is deep down unpredictable. And that's going back, at least to the middle of the 20th century for this kind of view of the world, and with a big stress in writers like Russell or Popper about how deeply unpredictable history is, and therefore people who think that history is inherently progressive are deeply at fault. Now, my question is, I guess, are you basically endorsing that view? Because sometimes you seem to want to say, well, no, we can pull something progressive, a progressive hope out of history. They didn't say, of course, you couldn't hope, or that you couldn't work for a better future, or at least that you couldn't try and stop things getting worse. They thought these were all real possibilities, but they sort of certainly took all the inevitability out of any conception of how the world works and how history is likely to develop. And that's partly by the fact they also were aware of, nature isn't just a backdrop. It interacts with human beings to develop things. So my question is, are you endorsing what I would like to call Bloomsbury semi-pessimism about the world?
I think this lecture was already more than long enough, so I didn't include this. But I think the way that I would think about progress is on the model of how Adorno thought about progress. So coming out, I think, of some similar pessimistic experiences, he said the only hope for progress is to abandon the idea of progress. Right? So in that sense, I agree that these modes of, that part of what we're trying to do is get out of this experience of inexorability. So we need, in that sense, to experience more openness, and to see history as being open in that way, I think, is important. At the same time, I do also think that there are real constraints on what's possible, right? I mean, it's like we make our own history, but not as we choose. And so I do think that trying to find the right way to articulate the fact that nothing is set in stone, but there are still stones, as it were, is trying to find the right conceptual space.
Why did you limit it to climate change? Why didn't you address all the other angles, aspects of the human predicament? I'm thinking of ecological overshoot, I'm thinking of resource depletion, dissipation, all the rest of it. I appreciate you only had one lecture, but why did you keep it to that one aspect?
Well, I've got 6 lectures, actually, so I'm happy to say that some of that will come up more in other lectures. But I think partly it's because I wouldn't exactly say I'm taking what you're talking about as a starting point, but I think there are ways where this is clearly not a lecture that talks to people who are confident that we're not overshooting things, right? That is to say, there's a certain amount of overshoot that's assumed as a starting point for these arguments. So I'm not trying to argue to establish that, because I think it's reasonably clear. And I think the question is, what do we do about it? What follows from that? How does that change our understanding of things?
It was interesting, your reference to the indigenous approach. So I take it when you refer to we should do something, we should do that, you include not only Western, industrialized, weird people like us, but you also refer to, say, people who are still early phases of economic development and who may not have the luxury to consider an alternative to the type of economic growth, which also implies some time conception, that has been proven to be the only way to get out of poverty. So I just wondered, who do you include when you speak about we?
So there's a lot of different we's, I think, in this talk. And the first we is just us in the room, and I guess everyone out there in TV land. But I think the basic question you're asking is about really a politics of growth or degrowth, right? And I very deliberately tried to sidestep some of that in this particular framing of the conversation, because I'm not sure that that's always a productive way of talking about it, right? I think that what counts as economic growth could be an open question or could be reopened. So I certainly want to stand against poverty. And I think that any world in which poverty persists is going to be a very unjust one. But I'm reluctant to say that the only way to get out of poverty is to destroy the planet, because I don't think we want to put ourselves in that kind of a position. We might want to find other solutions, or at least try. And so I do think it's notable, right, when I was talking about the Society of the Spectacle, Debord himself is quite clear. He means this to be a global phenomenon. Now, he's operating in the context of a Cold War, but part of the project of updating this view in the comments on the Society of the Spectacle was to consider how geopolitics had changed, and he thought basically the world had all become one spectacle by that point. And you can see here, right, it's like people use their phones, people are engaged in social media and all this kind of stuff everywhere. That way of experiencing reality and understanding politics is not limited to weird countries. And so I do think that there are important elements of this analysis that travel.
Thanks for a wonderful talk that gave us so much to think about. It reminded me in particular of a beautiful protest passage in Nietzsche where he's decrying the arrival of the wristwatch. Yeah. And I really like the way you're working with Guy Debord. It's so interesting. And what I wondered, because one thing I've noticed is the way the spectacle is presenting the climate crisis to us. Usually, I'm thinking of the genre of apocalypse, which seems to have taken over almost. And this is small and big screens and our tiny screens on our phones. And so I was wondering, as you were working on this, and of course I know you've got lectures to come and it's part of a wider work, but do you watch the films associated that kind of manage, and always there seems to be, there's this terrible climate crisis coming, isn't it exciting? And might you be the hero who survives this and creates a survivor community because you had those skills or something? So there's a sort of narcissism there in the survivor type. So I was wondering, do you watch those films? And is that part of reflecting on the place of spectacle here?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that, of course, a lot of politics of this gets filtered through those experiences. That is how a lot of people learn to think about these issues. And I think you're absolutely right about the limits of those forms of kind of popular climate apocalypticism. And of course, maybe it would feel different if there was like a larger climate movement that people were then compelled to join, right? Of course, that was part of the wager of turning How to Blow Up a Pipeline into a movie, which is on Netflix and or Disney Plus, I forget which one it's on, was that it could do that. They could galvanize that by telling a kind of heist thriller genre story to move people into that. But I think that actually the movies that I've found that most productively engage with climate are, maybe not coincidentally, given the argument I've made, slow movies, right? So in particular, I think a lot about Terrence Malick's movie, The New World, but in general, Malick's ways of approaching nature in film, I think are really productive for trying to think about ways that these images could help us engage in or produce a different relationship with nature. So that's where I look to for a more productive way of portraying it.
So thank you. We are out of time. I sincerely hope we'll continue the conversation in the staff club for the reception. Please join me in thanking them one more time.